In 1964, a group of Chrysler engineers stood in the staging lanes at Detroit Dragway, watching their competition lineup. They had just set a new national record. Their car, a factory-backed Dodge with an engine so radical it would be banned within months, had dominated every class it entered. And the crazy part? They weren't professional racers. They were engineers. Guys who spent their weekdays designing passenger cars and their weekends rewriting the rules of drag racing. Here's what most people don't realize about this story. It wasn't just about going fast. It was about a small group of obsessive, systematic thinkers who were so far ahead of everyone else that the sport itself had to change the rules just to survive their presence. This is Motorsport Heritage, and I spend way too much time thinking about the golden era of American factory drag racing. If you're someone who geeks out over the engineering brilliance hidden behind classic muscle car motorsport history, make sure to hit the subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up if this helps you out. So let's talk about the Ram Chargers. And look, before you scroll away thinking this is just another nostalgic trip through old drag racing footage, I want you to understand something up front. This story is not really about cars. It's about what happens when genuinely brilliant people decide to apply real scientific discipline to a world that's running almost entirely on gut instinct and bravado. It's about what happens when the smartest guys in the room also happen to love going sideways at full throttle. And it's about how one team, working out of Detroit with access to factory resources, but none of the corporate accountability, fundamentally changed how American motorsport operates. The Ram Chargers didn't just win races, they forced the sport to evolve. They held up a mirror to drag racing and said, "Look, here's everything you're doing wrong, and here's the math to prove it." And the rest of the field, including Ford, Chevrolet, and Pontiac with all their money and resources, spent the better part of a decade trying to catch up. Now, you might be thinking, okay, dominant racing team, I've heard this kind of story before. What makes the Ram Chargers different? Here's the thing. Most dominant teams in motorsport history had overwhelming financial advantages, or a singular genius driver, or access to technology that nobody else had. The Ram Chargers had none of that in the traditional sense. What they had was a culture, a way of approaching problems that was fundamentally different from everyone else in their world. While other teams were bolting on bigger carburetors and hoping for the best, the Ram Chargers were running controlled experiments, documenting results, analyzing data, and iterating. They were applying the same methodology to a 1962 Dodge Superstock that modern Formula One teams apply to their wind tunnel sessions, and they were doing it before most people in motorsport even understood why that mattered. The Ram Chargers started in 1959, which honestly seems late when you think about it. Drag racing had been evolving since the late 40s, growing from illegal street racing into a legitimate, sanctioned sport. The National Hot Rod Association had been running events since 1951, and by the end of the 50s, there were tracks across the country, established classes, and a rapidly growing fan base hungry for American muscle pushed to its absolute limits. But here's the critical context most people miss. Factory involvement was officially off the table. The Automobile Manufacturers Association had signed an agreement in 1957 to withdraw from factory-backed racing programs. The stated reason was safety and public perception. The real reason was more complicated, involving liability, politics, and the very real concern that promoting high-performance vehicles to the public was a PR nightmare waiting to happen. Now, that agreement, it was about as binding as a pinky promise at a poker table. Everyone knew manufacturers were still involved behind the scenes, but officially, the factories weren't racing. And that gap between official policy and actual practice is exactly where the Ram Chargers were born. They weren't a factory team. Not exactly. They were Chrysler employees who happened to love drag racing. Engineers, mostly. Tom Hoover, who would become the team's technical backbone and one of the most consequential engine minds in American automotive history. Dick Maxwell, Tom Coddington, a rotating cast of about a dozen guys who clocked in at Chrysler during the day and tore apart race engines at night. Their semi-official status was, And this is the part that makes the story genuinely fascinating, their single greatest competitive advantage. They had access to factory dynos, machine shops, and prototype components. But they didn't have the bureaucratic oversight that came with being an official corporate racing program. They could experiment without committee approval. They could fail without press releases. They could take risks that a fully official factory effort would never sanction. And they could move fast, decisively, without asking permission. According to historical records compiled by drag racing historians and former Chrysler personnel, the Ram Charger's first serious competition vehicle was a 1949 Dodge Run in 1959 with a modified Hemi engine, not exactly competitive by the standards of the day. But that's not the point. That car was a classroom. Every run was a lesson. They were learning the tracks, learning the technique, absorbing the culture of organized drag racing, and most critically, they were figuring out what variables actually mattered. Because here's the thing about engineering culture applied to motorsport. You don't just want to win. You want to know why you won. And more importantly, you want to know why you lost, so you never lose that way again. By 1962, the education phase was over. Chrysler released the 413 cubic inch max wedge engine, a purpose-designed drag racing power plant that nominally made around 410 horsepower, but responded dramatically to the right modifications. The Ram Chargers got their hands on one of the first units off the line and immediately did what engineers do. They took it apart. Not carelessly, methodically. They mapped every flow restriction, every combustion chamber inefficiency, every area where the factories need to build something cost-effectively had left performance on the table. And then, they fixed it. Port matching, head porting, valve seat optimization, carburetor experimentation, all of it documented, all of it tested on the dyno, quantified, and then validated at the track. Their Dodge, nicknamed the High and Mighty due to its radically altered front suspension geometry, began winning immediately. Not occasionally, consistently. Record after record, and nobody could figure out what they were doing differently, because from the outside the car looked almost stock. Here's what separated the Ram Chargers from every other team showing up to those early 60s drag strips. Everyone else was focused on one thing. Power. More cubic inches, bigger carburetors, wilder camshaft profiles. The entire drag racing community in 1962 was essentially having one long argument about horsepower numbers. And look, horsepower matters, obviously. But the Ram Chargers had already moved past that conversation. They were asking a completely different question. Not how do we make more power, but how do we make sure all the power we already have actually reaches the pavement? And that shift in thinking, that reframing of the fundamental problem, is what made them genuinely dangerous. Think about it this way. Imagine two cars lined up at the Christmas tree. Both have identical engines, identical horsepower, identical torque curves. But one of them launches with its rear tires spinning helplessly, clawing for grip, burning rubber but not moving forward efficiently. The other one hooks up instantly, rear tires biting hard, transferring every single pound of torque directly into forward motion. That second car wins. Every single time. Not because it has more power, because it uses its power better. This seems obvious when you say it out loud in 2024. In 1962, it was practically a revolutionary concept in drag racing circles. The Ram Chargers didn't just understand it intellectually. They engineered solutions around it with a precision nobody else was applying. Tom Hoover and the team had been studying weight transfer dynamics with the same rigor they brought to engine development. When a rear-wheel drive car accelerates hard, weight shifts rearward. That increases the load on the rear tires, which increases their grip potential. But the geometry of how that weight transfers, how quickly it moves, how much of it reaches the contact patch, that's all determined by suspension design, ride height, center of gravity location, and the relationship between those variables. The Ram Chargers mapped all of it. They ran calculations. They tested different setups systematically. And then they altered the High and Mighty's front suspension geometry in ways that deliberately promoted aggressive weight transfer on launch. Combined with their engine work, the result was a car that hooked up better than anything else on the property, and did it every single pass, not just when conditions were perfect. Here's what most people don't realize about that period of drag racing history. Consistency was arguably more valuable than peak performance. A car that ran 11.8 seconds every single pass was more competitive than a car that occasionally ran 11.5, but went 11.9 when the humidity was wrong or the driver was off by a fraction. The Ram Charger's engineering approach naturally produced consistency, because they understood the variables and controlled them. Other teams were at the mercy of conditions they didn't fully understand. The Ram Chargers had already modeled those conditions and built cars that performed within a predictable, optimized range regardless. According to accounts from former team members documented in multiple drag racing historical archives, this systematic approach to consistency was as deliberate as any specific technical modification they ever made. By the end of the 1962 season, the Ram Chargers held multiple national records and had established themselves unambiguously as the team to beat in superstock competition. And the competition was not weak. Ford had factory-supported efforts behind their high-performance division. Chevrolet had the Z11 program, throwing significant resources at their big block entries. Pontiac was backing their Super Duty cars with genuine engineering muscle. These were serious operations with real budgets and talented people. But none of them could match the Ram Charger's consistency, and none of them fully understood why. The Ram Charger's advantage wasn't any single secret weapon. It was the accumulation of dozens of small optimizations, each one worth a few horsepower or a few hundredths of a second, that combined into a margin nobody could bridge through conventional means. Now you might be thinking, surely the other manufacturers eventually figured out what they were doing and just copied it. And here's where it gets really interesting. Some of them did try. But copying a result without understanding the process that produced it doesn't actually work in engineering. You can look at a ported cylinder head and replicate the shape, but if you don't understand why those specific port dimensions produce better flow at those specific RPM ranges, you can't optimize it further. You can't adapt it when the rules change. You're just reproducing an answer without understanding the question. The Ram Chargers owned the question. That's why they could keep producing new answers faster than anyone else could copy the old ones. Let me give you a concrete example of how this played out. During the 1962 season, the team discovered through dyno testing that a specific carburetor jet size produced measurably better results at a particular track elevation than the setup they'd been running. Not a dramatic difference. Maybe a couple of tenths of a second over the quarter mile. But they documented it. They understood the underlying reason, which involved fuel mixture density changes at different altitudes. And when they went to a track at different elevation, they already knew what adjustments to make before they unloaded the car. Other teams were making those adjustments by feel, by trial and error during expensive and time-limited practice sessions. The Ram Chargers arrived knowing that's the difference between racing and engineering, and the Ram Chargers were doing both simultaneously. The 1963 season was when the rest of the drag racing world really started to pay attention. Chrysler had updated the max wedge to 426 cubic inches, extracting even more potential from the basic architecture. The Ram Chargers had been involved in the development of this updated engine, providing feedback from real competition use that shaped how Chrysler refined the production version. When it hit the market, the Ram Chargers already knew its secrets. They had months of dyno data on prototype versions. They knew exactly where the power was hiding and exactly how to find it. The result was what drag racing historians have described as a rampage. They won the NHRA Winter National Superstock class. They won the U.S. Nationals, which was and remains the most prestigious event in drag racing. They set elapsed time records that stood for months, which in the rapidly evolving technical environment of 1963 was genuinely remarkable. Here's a statistic that puts this into context. According to historical NHRA records and period reporting from Hot Rod magazine, during the 1963 season the Ram Chargers and their associated Chrysler-backed entries won an estimated 60% of major superstock events they entered. In a field that included well-funded efforts from Ford, Chevrolet, and Pontiac, that dominance ratio is almost incomprehensible. It wasn't luck. It wasn't one great car or one inspired driver. It was a systematic, repeatable process producing systematic, repeatable results. Look, the competition brought their best stuff to every event. They ran respectable times. They had talented drivers and capable equipment. And then they watched the Ram Chargers beat them by half a second or more in heads-up competition. Half a second in drag racing is an eternity. It's the difference between competitive and embarrassing. What made 1963 particularly significant beyond the wins was what was happening behind the scenes at Chrysler. Because while the Ram Chargers were destroying the competition with the Max Wedge, Tom Hoover and select colleagues were already working on something else entirely. Something that would make the Max Wedge look conservative. Something that would force drag racing to fundamentally reconsider what production-based racing even meant. They were developing what would become the 426 Hemi, and the Ram Chargers weren't just going to receive that engine when it was ready. They were helping build it. Testing prototypes on the dyno at night. Running evaluation sessions on private tracks. Feeding real-world competition data back into the development process in a loop that blurred the line between racing team and engineering department. Because for the Ram Chargers, that line had never really existed in the first place. They were always both things simultaneously, and that dual identity was the foundation of everything they achieved. The 426 Hemi changed everything. Not gradually, not incrementally, but in the sudden, jarring way that a truly revolutionary piece of technology disrupts an established order. When Chrysler unveiled the engine in early 1964, it wasn't an evolution of the Max Wedge. It was a completely new design built around hemispherical combustion chambers, a concept that Chrysler had used successfully in the 50s but had shelved during the Wedge era. Tom Hoover was the driving force behind bringing the Hemi concept back, and he brought to it everything the Ram Chargers had learned through years of competition testing. The combustion chamber shape allowed for larger valves positioned at more favorable angles, which meant dramatically better airflow, which meant more power per cubic inch than anyone had thought possible with a production-based engine. Here's the thing about the Hemi that gets lost in the mythology surrounding it. It wasn't just powerful. Lots of engines were powerful. The Hemi was efficient. It extracted more energy from each combustion event than competing designs. The hemispherical chamber shape promoted more complete fuel burn, reduced hotspots that caused detonation, and allowed higher compression ratios without the reliability problems that plagued other high-performance engines. For the Ram Chargers, who had spent years optimizing every variable they could control, the Hemi was like being handed an entirely new canvas. Everything they knew about engine tuning, weight transfer, suspension dynamics, and race strategy now applied to a platform with fundamentally higher potential. It was as if they had been running a sprint in heavy boots, and someone suddenly gave them racing flats. The Hemi's competition debut at the 1964 NHRA Winter Nationals was, by any objective measure, a demolition. The Ram Chargers and other Chrysler-backed teams running the new engine didn't just win, they made the rest of the field look like they were racing in a different category entirely. Times that would have been competitive in 1963 were suddenly irrelevant. The gap between Hemi-powered cars and everything else was so large that some competitors reportedly refused to stage next to them, knowing the outcome before the tree even dropped. According to period reporting from multiple drag racing publications, the Hemi cars were running elapsed times a full second faster than the best non-Hemi entries in the same class. A full second! In a sport where hundredths matter, that margin was beyond enormous. It was existentially threatening to every other manufacturer's racing program. Now you might be thinking, well, if Chrysler had a better engine, that's just competition. The cream rises, right? And you wouldn't be wrong, except for one critical detail that made the Hemi situation genuinely controversial. Superstock racing was supposed to be about cars that regular people could buy and drive. That was the whole premise. The classes were defined around production vehicles with production engines. The idea was that a fan could watch a Dodge win on Sunday and go buy one on Monday. The 426 Hemi violated the spirit of that premise in ways that were difficult to ignore. Chrysler was building the Hemi in extremely limited numbers, just enough to meet the technical definition of a production engine for racing homologation purposes. The average person walking into a Dodge dealer in 1964 was not driving home in a Hemi car. The engine cost a fortune, required premium fuel, and had a temperament more suited to a racetrack than a daily commute. It was, for all practical purposes, a purpose-built racing engine that happened to be installable in a passenger car body. Ford screamed, Chevrolet protested, Pontiac filed formal objections, and they all had a point. The competitive balance of superstock drag racing had been obliterated overnight, and it had been obliterated by an engine that existed primarily to win races, not to sell cars to the public. This is where it gets really interesting, because the ensuing controversy forced NHRA and other sanctioning bodies to confront a question they had been avoiding for years. What exactly is a production vehicle? Where does the line sit between a performance option that a manufacturer offers to enthusiastic customers and a racing weapon disguised as a catalog option? The Ram Chargers and Chrysler had exposed a fundamental ambiguity in the rules, and now the entire sport had to deal with it. NHRA's response came in 1965, and it hit Chrysler hard. The Hemi was either banned outright from certain superstock classes, or subjected to weight penalties so severe that its power advantage was effectively neutralized. The specific regulations varied depending on the class and the sanctioning body, but the message was clear. The Hemi was too much. It had broken the competitive ecosystem, and the rulemakers were going to fix that by constraining it. Depending on your perspective, this was either a reasonable and necessary correction to maintain competitive balance, or it was a nakedly political move designed to protect Ford and Chevrolet's racing investments from a competitor who had simply out-engineered them. The Ram Chargers' response to the Hemi restrictions reveals everything you need to know about their organizational DNA. They didn't complain. They didn't threaten to leave the sport. They didn't spend months lobbying officials. They read the new rules, identified the parameters, and immediately started engineering within them. If the Hemi was penalized, fine. They would go back to the max wedge and find more performance in the wedge architecture. If weight penalties were the mechanism being used against them, they would find weight to remove. If certain modifications were now restricted, they would shift their attention to unrestricted areas and find advantages there. This adaptability wasn't incidental. It was structural. The Ram Charger's systematic approach to racing meant they didn't depend on any single advantage. They accumulated advantages across every dimension of the car, so that when one dimension was constrained, the others could compensate. Most teams were built around one big thing: a powerful engine, a skilled driver, a deep wallet. Take that one thing away, and the team collapsed. The Ram Chargers were built around a process, and a process is much harder to legislate against than a product. And this is where I want to address something that I think a lot of people misunderstand about the Ram Chargers and about dominant teams in general. There's a tendency to frame rule changes as punishments for success. The narrative goes, the Ram Chargers were too good, so the authorities penalized them. That framing is emotionally satisfying but not entirely accurate. Sanctioning bodies have a legitimate responsibility to maintain competitive balance. A sport where one team wins every race is a sport that loses its audience. The rulemakers weren't punishing the Ram Chargers. They were responding to a competitive imbalance that threatened the sport's viability. The Ram Chargers' relentless innovation was genuinely beneficial for the sport in terms of advancing technology and raising overall performance levels. But it was genuinely problematic for the sport in terms of producing compelling entertainment. Both things can be true simultaneously. What made 1965 and 1966 particularly fascinating was how the broader competitive landscape adjusted to the post-Hemi reality. Ford's 427 wedge engines suddenly became viable frontrunners again. Chevrolet's big block programs gained new relevance. The playing field leveled, at least on paper, and the competition became genuinely tighter. But the Ram Chargers kept winning. Different cars, different classes, different rules, but the same results. Because their advantage had never been just the Hemi. The Hemi had amplified their existing advantages, but removing it didn't remove them. They still had better data. They still had better processes. They still had a deeper understanding of the variables that determined elapsed times. And they still had Tom Hoover, who by this point had developed an almost preternatural ability to look at a set of dyno numbers and see opportunities that nobody else saw. Look, I want to be specific here because vague claims about engineering superiority are easy to make and hard to verify. Let me give you an example from this period that illustrates the Ram Charger's approach in concrete terms. When the Hemi was restricted and the team shifted focus back to wedge engines, they didn't just bolt on the same parts they had used 2 years earlier. They went back to first principles. They re-examined the wedge combustion chamber with fresh eyes, informed by everything they had learned from Hemi development. They discovered that specific modifications to the wedge chamber's quench area, the flat section of the combustion chamber that promotes turbulence in the air-fuel mixture, could extract meaningfully more power from the architecture. These were modifications measured in thousandths of an inch. Changes so subtle that most machinists wouldn't even notice them during tech inspection. But on the dyno, they were worth measurable horsepower. And across a quarter mile, those few extra horsepower translated into hundredths of seconds that, accumulated across every other small optimization the team applied, added up to winning margins. This is the part of the Ram Charger story that I find most compelling and most instructive for anyone interested in what it actually takes to sustain competitive excellence. It wasn't about having the best single idea. It was about having 50 good ideas, each one contributing a tiny fraction of improvement, layered on top of each other with systematic precision. Any individual optimization might have been worth 1/100th of a second. Meaningless in isolation. But 5,000ths of a second is half a second. And half a second in superstock drag racing is the difference between standing on the winner's podium and loading your car back onto the trailer wondering what went wrong. The altered wheelbase experiments of 1965 deserve their own chapter in the Ram Charger story, because they represent possibly the most dramatic example of what happens when engineers encounter a rulebook with ambiguity in it. See, the rules at that time specified minimum wheelbase measurements for different vehicle classes. A car had to have a wheelbase of at least a certain length to qualify for its class. Simple enough. But here's what the rules didn't specify. They didn't say where within the body shell the axles had to be located. They defined the distance between the front and rear axles, but not the relationship between those axles and the body panels surrounding them. To most people, this distinction is meaningless. The wheels go where the wheels go, right? The factory put them there for a reason. But to the Ram Chargers, this was an enormous opportunity hiding in plain sight. Think about it from a physics perspective. If you could move the rear axle forward while keeping the overall wheelbase legal, you would shift the car's weight distribution dramatically rearward. More weight over the drive wheels means more traction at launch. And if you move the front axle forward simultaneously, you maintain the legal wheelbase dimension while completely transforming the vehicle's dynamic behavior. The math was compelling. The engineering was straightforward. The only question was whether anyone would actually do it. The Ram Chargers did it. And so did several other teams around the same time, because good ideas in racing tend to occur to multiple people simultaneously. But the Ram Chargers, characteristically, did it with more precision and more systematic development than anyone else. The resulting cars looked bizarre. The wheels were visibly displaced from their normal positions within the wheel wells. The proportions were wrong in a way that your eye immediately registered, even if you couldn't articulate exactly what had changed. These became known as funny cars, a name born from the reaction of spectators who thought the vehicles looked, well, funny, strange, off somehow. But underneath that strange appearance was devastatingly effective engineering. The altered wheelbase cars hooked up harder than anything else on the track. Their weight transfer characteristics were optimized in ways that conventional production-based vehicles simply couldn't match. And the Ram Chargers version, predictably, was among the most refined implementations in the field. Now here's what most people don't realize about the funny car evolution. It wasn't just a gimmick or a one-season experiment. It fundamentally altered the trajectory of professional drag racing. NHRA and other sanctioning bodies looked at these altered wheelbase vehicles and recognized that they had moved beyond anything that could reasonably be called superstock. These weren't production cars anymore, not in any meaningful sense. They were custom race cars wearing production body shells. The sanctioning bodies had two choices: ban them entirely, or create a new class for them. They chose the latter, and in doing so, they birthed what would become one of the most popular and spectacular categories in all of drag racing. Modern funny car racing, with its nitromethane-burning engines and carbon fiber bodies and 1,000-foot courses, traces its lineage directly back to those altered wheelbase experiments of the mid-60s. The Ram Chargers didn't invent funny car racing single-handedly, but they were among the primary catalysts for its creation. Their relentless exploitation of the rules had once again forced the sport to evolve. And this pattern, innovation followed by rule change, followed by new innovation, became the defining rhythm of the Ram Charger's existence throughout the mid to late 60s. Every season brought new boundaries to test, new ambiguities to exploit, new areas where engineering discipline could extract advantages that intuition-based teams simply couldn't find. Let me walk you through a few more examples, because the accumulation of these instances is really the story itself. In 1966 and 1967, NHRA implemented increasingly detailed specifications for what counted as a legal cylinder head modification in superstock. This was a direct response to the Ram Chargers and other top teams who had been reworking factory heads to a degree that blurred the line between modification and fabrication. The porting work being done on those heads was extraordinary. Skilled machinists, working by hand with die grinders and carbide burrs, were reshaping the intake and exhaust ports to optimize airflow at specific RPM ranges. The Ram Charger's headwork was particularly sophisticated because it was informed by flow bench data and dyno correlation studies that most teams simply didn't have access to or didn't think to perform. They knew exactly how much material to remove from each area of the port. They knew how the port shape affected flow velocity at different valve lift points. They knew the relationship between port volume and mixture velocity, and how that relationship changed with engine speed. Other teams were porting heads based on accumulated experience and intuition. The Ram Chargers were porting heads based on data. When the rules tightened around head modifications, specifying maximum port volumes and requiring closer adherence to factory dimensions, the Ram Chargers shifted their attention to intake manifolds. When intake manifold rules tightened, they moved to exhaust system optimization. When exhaust restrictions appeared, they focused on ignition timing precision and fuel delivery calibration. Each time a door closed, they found a window. Each time a window closed, they found a crack. And each time, they extracted performance from areas that other teams considered fully optimized because those teams lacked the systematic approach to identify remaining opportunities. I want to pause here and talk about something that doesn't get enough attention in stories about the Ram Chargers: the human element. Because it's easy to talk about engineering processes and systematic approaches and make it sound like the Ram Chargers were some kind of racing algorithm. They weren't. They were people. Talented, passionate, sometimes difficult people who argued about technical details and occasionally made mistakes and had to navigate the same interpersonal dynamics that every team deals with. Tom Hoover, by all accounts, was brilliant, but demanding. He expected the same level of rigor from everyone around him that he applied to his own work, and not everyone could meet that standard consistently. The team's rotating membership over the years reflected both the natural career progression of its members and the occasional friction that comes from putting strong personalities together under competitive pressure. But here's what held them together through all of that: a shared conviction that racing could and should be approached with engineering discipline. That answer should be found through testing, not guessing. that every failure was information, not defeat. This shared philosophy created a culture that persisted even as individual members came and went. New people joining the Ram Chargers were expected to adopt that culture, and most did, because the results spoke for themselves. You couldn't argue with the trophies. You couldn't argue with the record books. And you couldn't argue with the fact that every other team in the country was trying to figure out how to do what the Ram Chargers were already doing. This is where it gets really interesting from a broader perspective, because the Ram Chargers' influence extended far beyond their own results. As their methods became known throughout the drag racing community, other teams started adopting similar approaches. Flow bench testing, which the Ram Chargers had been doing since the early 60s, became standard practice by the end of the decade. Systematic dyno development, rather than trial and error modification, spread throughout the sport. The idea that chassis setup and weight transfer management were as important as raw engine power gradually became accepted wisdom. In a very real sense, the Ram Chargers raised the overall level of competition in American drag racing by demonstrating what was possible when you treated it as an engineering discipline rather than a mechanical hobby. According to drag racing historian and author Robert Jennett, whose research into factory racing programs of the 60s remains some of the most comprehensive available, the Ram Chargers' approach to documentation and data analysis was a decade ahead of standard practice in sportsman-level drag racing. Teams that competed against them in the early 60s later described the experience as educational. They lost, but they learned from losing. They watched how the Ram Chargers prepared. They noticed the meticulous attention to detail, the pre-race checklists, the post-run data analysis. And gradually they incorporated those practices into their own programs. The sport got better because the Ram Chargers forced it to. By 1968, the landscape of professional drag racing had shifted considerably from where it stood when the Ram Chargers began their run of dominance. The rules were more comprehensive, more carefully written, and more aggressively enforced. The loopholes that had allowed creative teams to gain dramatic advantages were being closed systematically. Tech inspection had evolved from a cursory glance into a genuine technical examination that could catch modifications previous inspectors would have missed entirely. And the competition had gotten measurably better. Ford's racing programs had matured significantly. Chevrolet was investing heavily. Even AMC was getting into the game. The era of one team dominating through superior methodology was giving way to an era where multiple teams were applying similar levels of discipline, and the advantages were shrinking accordingly. The Ram Chargers adapted to this new reality, as they always did, but the margins were tighter now. Wins that had previously come by half a second were now decided by hundredths. Races that had been foregone conclusions were now genuine competitions. And the psychological advantage the Ram Chargers had long enjoyed, the knowledge that competitors were intimidated before the race even started, was eroding as other teams built confidence through their own systematic improvements. This wasn't a decline for the Ram Chargers so much as an elevation of everyone around them. They were still excellent. They were still winning. But the gap between their excellence and everyone else's had narrowed to the point where individual race outcomes were no longer predictable, and in some ways that was their greatest legacy. Not the wins themselves, but the raising of standards that made winning harder for everyone, including them. If you've made it this far, you're clearly invested in this story, and I appreciate that. Quick question for you. Where are you watching from right now? Drop it in the comments. I genuinely want to know where in the world people care about this stuff as much as I do. And if you haven't subscribed yet, now would be a great time. We go deep on stories like this every single week, and I promise you, the rabbit holes only get deeper from here. The late 60s brought changes that even the Ram Chargers couldn't engineer their way around. Not because the challenges were technical, but because they were political, economic, and cultural. The muscle car era was reaching its absolute peak in terms of horsepower and public excitement, but the forces that would end it were already gathering momentum. Insurance companies were raising rates on high-performance vehicles to punitive levels. The federal government was implementing new safety and emissions regulations that would fundamentally constrain what manufacturers could build and sell. Consumer advocacy groups were questioning whether it was responsible for car companies to market raw speed to the general public. And within the corporations themselves, the executives who had enabled and encouraged factory racing programs were being replaced by a new generation of leaders who saw racing as a liability rather than an asset. Chrysler was not immune to any of this. The company's financial position in the late 60s was increasingly precarious. The massive investments in racing programs, performance engine development, and the entire high-performance vehicle ecosystem were becoming harder to justify to shareholders who wanted to see returns, not trophies. The Ram Chargers felt these pressures acutely. Their budgets fluctuated from season to season in ways that made long-term planning difficult. One year they would have access to everything they needed. The next year the money would be cut, and they would be scrounging for resources in ways that reminded the veteran members of the team's earliest days, before factory support was formalized. Here's the thing about organizational excellence in the face of resource constraints. It reveals whether the excellence was genuine, or whether it was just what adequate resources look like when applied to a favorable competitive environment. The Ram Chargers proved their excellence was genuine because they continued to compete effectively even when the money tightened. They made do with less. They prioritized ruthlessly, focusing their limited resources on the optimizations that produced the most return per dollar spent. They leveraged the institutional knowledge they had accumulated over nearly a decade of systematic competition to make smarter decisions faster than teams with more money but less experience. But the broader environment was shifting in ways that no amount of engineering brilliance could counteract. In 1970, the original Ram Chargers Club began to fragment. Some members had been promoted within Chrysler into positions that consumed more of their time and energy. Others had left the company entirely for opportunities elsewhere in the automotive industry. The informal, club-based structure that had been the Ram Chargers' organizational foundation was never designed to survive this kind of attrition. A formal factory racing team would have replaced departing members through institutional hiring processes. The Ram Chargers replaced members through personal relationships and shared passion. And when the pool of passionate, available engineers with the right skill sets began to shrink, the team's ability to sustain its previous levels of performance eroded accordingly. Tom Hoover remained at Chrysler and continued contributing to engine programs that would influence the company's trajectory for decades. His fingerprints were all over the production Hemi engines that powered some of the most iconic muscle cars ever built. The 1966 to 1971 Street Hemi, the engine that turned the Plymouth Barracuda and Dodge Charger into legends, was a direct descendant of the racing Hemi that Hoover and the Ram Chargers had helped develop and prove in competition. Every time someone fires up a restored Hemi Cuda today, every time a collector pays 7 figures at auction for a numbers-matching Hemi car, they are interacting with the Ram Chargers' legacy whether they know it or not. And that legacy extended far beyond Chrysler. The Ram Chargers members who dispersed into the broader automotive industry carried with them the systematic approaches they had developed during the team's peak years. Some went to other manufacturers, some went into the aftermarket performance parts industry. Some became consultants, bringing engineering discipline to racing teams that had previously operated on instinct and tradition. In a very real sense, the Ram Chargers' dissolution was also their proliferation. Their ideas, their methods, their fundamental approach to competition spread through the industry like seeds carried on the wind, taking root in organizations across the country and producing results that can be traced back to those midnight dyno sessions in Detroit. Now, I want to address something that comes up whenever you tell the story of a dominant team that eventually faded. There is a temptation to frame the ending as a failure, to suggest that the Ram Chargers somehow fell short because they didn't sustain their dominance forever. This framing is wrong, and I think it reveals a misunderstanding about what competitive excellence actually looks like in practice. No team dominates forever. Not in motorsport, not in any sport, not in any competitive endeavor of any kind. Dominance is inherently temporary because the systems that produce it also inspire the imitation that eventually neutralizes it. The Ram Chargers didn't fail. They succeeded so thoroughly that they elevated everyone around them to the point where their advantages no longer produced the same margins. That's not failure. That's the highest possible form of competitive success. Look, let me put this in perspective with some numbers that illustrate the scope of what the Ram Chargers accomplished during their peak years. From 1962 through 1969, the team and their closely associated Chrysler-backed entries won national championships in multiple NHRA classes across multiple seasons. They held national elapsed time and speed records on numerous occasions. They were directly involved in the development of at least 3 distinct engine families: the Max Wedge, the Race Hemi, and the Street Hemi, that collectively represent some of the most significant powerplant achievements in American automotive history. And they contributed to the creation of an entirely new category of professional drag racing through their altered wheelbase experiments. For a team that started as a dozen guys with a 1949 Dodge and a shared love of going fast, that resume is staggering. Here's what most people don't realize about the Ram Chargers' legacy in the context of modern motorsport. Many of the practices that contemporary racing teams take for granted, practices that are considered so fundamental they barely warrant mention, were pioneered or significantly advanced by the Ram Chargers and teams like them during the 60s. The idea that you should test modifications on a dyno before installing them on a race car. The concept that suspension tuning and weight distribution management are as critical as engine performance. The practice of documenting every modification, every test result, every race outcome in a systematic way that allows for pattern recognition and continuous improvement. These seem obvious now. They were not obvious in 1962. Someone had to demonstrate their value through results, and the Ram Chargers were among the first and most effective demonstrators. Consider how modern professional drag racing teams operate. They have dedicated data acquisition systems recording dozens of parameters on every run. They have engineering staff analyzing that data between rounds. They have computational tools modeling vehicle dynamics, engine performance, and atmospheric effects. They approach racing as a quantitative discipline where decisions are driven by data rather than intuition. This is the Ram Chargers' philosophical legacy, scaled up with modern technology. The tools have changed. The fundamental approach has not. And while the Ram Chargers were certainly not the only team contributing to this evolution, they were among the earliest and most influential. There is also the matter of their impact on the relationship between manufacturers and motorsport. The Ram Chargers existed in a unique space between factory program and independent team, and their success helped demonstrate to Chrysler and other manufacturers the value of supporting competition efforts. When Chrysler eventually formalized its racing programs in the mid-60s, the template was heavily influenced by what the Ram Chargers had already built informally. The idea that racing could serve as a development laboratory for production technology, that competition data could inform production engineering decisions, that racing success could drive showroom traffic. These ideas gained credibility through the Ram Chargers' demonstrated results. Modern manufacturer involvement in motorsport, from NASCAR to Formula One to sportsman drag racing, operates on assumptions that the Ram Chargers helped establish. I also want to talk about the rivalry with Ford, because it shaped both organizations in ways that are still visible today. The Ford versus Chrysler battle in superstock drag racing during the 60s was one of the most consequential competitive rivalries in American motorsport history. Ford's response to the Hemi, which included the development of the SOHC 427 Cammer engine, was directly motivated by the Ram Chargers' dominance with Chrysler power. The Cammer was Ford's attempt to match the Hemi's performance potential, and it was a formidable piece of engineering in its own right. When NHRA restricted the Hemi, Ford expected their moment had arrived. And to their credit, Ford teams did become significantly more competitive in the Hemi's absence. But the Ram Chargers' systematic advantages in chassis development, weight management, and race preparation meant that simply matching Chrysler's horsepower wasn't enough to guarantee victory. The rivalry pushed both manufacturers to invest more heavily in performance technology than they otherwise would have, producing engines and vehicles that became the icons of the American muscle car era. Without the Ram Chargers forcing Ford to respond, Without Ford's response forcing Chrysler to escalate further, the 60s performance landscape would have looked very different. Less extreme, less exciting, less memorable. That competitive pressure also accelerated the rule changes that eventually constrained everyone. The arms race between Chrysler and Ford in Superstock was exciting for fans, but alarming for sanctioning bodies trying to maintain some semblance of competitive balance and safety. Each escalation from one manufacturer prompted a counter-escalation from the other, producing vehicles that were faster, more powerful, and more specialized with each passing season. The rules struggled to keep pace, and the resulting regulatory complexity contributed to the fragmentation of drag racing into the numerous classes and categories that exist today. This fragmentation was not entirely the Ram Charger's doing, of course. Many teams and manufacturers contributed to the pressures that drove it. But the Ram Chargers were consistently at the leading edge of those pressures. Consistently the team forcing the most dramatic responses from rulemakers. Consistently the catalyst for change. What does it mean to leave a legacy in motorsport? It's a question worth sitting with for a moment, because the answer is less obvious than it seems. The easy answer is trophies. Championships. Records. And the Ram Chargers had all of those in abundance. But trophies sit in cases and records get broken and championships fade into historical footnotes that only the most dedicated enthusiasts bother to look up. The harder, more durable form of legacy is the kind that changes how people think. That rewires assumptions. That makes future generations approach problems differently, without necessarily knowing where that approach came from. That is the Ram Charger's real legacy. And it is hiding in plain sight across the entire landscape of American motorsport, if you know where to look. Think about the next time you watch any form of professional racing. Any form at all. Watch the crew working on the car between sessions. Watch the engineer with the laptop analyzing data while the driver debriefs. Watch the systematic, methodical way that top-level racing teams approach every variable they can control. That culture of engineering discipline applied to competition, that insistence on measurement over intuition and data over gut feeling, has roots that run back through decades of motorsport history to teams like the Ram Chargers who demonstrated its value before most people even understood what they were watching. The Ram Chargers were doing in 1962 what every serious racing team does today. They were just doing it 60 years earlier, in a world that hadn't yet accepted that this was how racing should be done. Here's what most people don't realize when they look back at the Ram Chargers story from the comfortable distance of the present. How genuinely hard it was to maintain that engineering culture under the conditions they were operating in. These were not full-time racers with dedicated facilities and unlimited development time. They were working engineers with day jobs, families, and all the ordinary complications of adult life. Their racing activities happened in the margins. Evenings, weekends. Stolen hours on the factory dyno when the regular work was done. The systematic approach they maintained under those conditions speaks to something deeper than professional discipline. It speaks to genuine passion channeled through exceptional talent. They weren't rigorous because rigor was their job. They were rigorous because they cared enough about getting it right to be rigorous even when nobody was requiring it of them. Tom Hoover's continued influence at Chrysler after the Ram Charger's peak years illustrates this perfectly. He didn't stop being the person who needed to understand why something worked after the racing program wound down. He carried that same intellectual intensity into his production engineering work, and the engines that resulted from that work became some of the most beloved power plants in American automotive history. The third-generation Hemi, introduced in 2003 and still in production today, owes its existence to the credibility that the racing Hemi established in the 60s. That credibility was built run by run, record by record, championship by championship, by a group of engineers who loved drag racing enough to spend their nights and weekends making it faster. Now, you might be thinking, this is a great story, but what does it actually mean for someone watching in the present? Why should the Ram Chargers matter to you today beyond their historical interest? And look, I think that's a fair challenge. Here's my answer. The Ram Chargers matter because they demonstrate something genuinely important about competitive excellence that applies far beyond motorsport. They show that sustained dominance comes from process, not from any single advantage. They show that the best competitors study the rules as carefully as they study the competition. They show that documentation and systematic analysis compound over time in ways that intuition-based approaches simply cannot match. And they show that adaptability, the ability to maintain excellence as conditions change, is the rarest and most valuable competitive quality of all. This is where it gets really interesting from a modern perspective. We live in an era of data analytics and performance optimization that would have seemed like science fiction to the Ram Chargers. Every major sport now employs teams of analysts doing in sophisticated computational environments what Tom Hoover and his colleagues were trying to do with slide rules and dyno printouts. The methods have evolved beyond recognition. The philosophy has not changed at all. Measure everything. Document everything. Find the variables that matter. Optimize them systematically. Adapt when the environment changes. Repeat. The Ram Chargers were practicing modern performance analytics before the computing power to properly implement it even existed. They were right about the approach. They just had to execute it with inferior tools. The altered wheelbase cars they developed became funny car racing. The engine development work they contributed to produced the Hemi, which remains one of the most recognizable performance brands in the world 60 years later. The systematic approaches they pioneered spread through the drag racing community and elevated the entire sport. The competitive pressure they applied to Ford and other manufacturers accelerated the development of performance technology that produced some of the greatest muscle cars in American history, and the documentation culture they established gave future historians and engineers a record of what was done and why. A record that continues to inform how people understand and restore the vehicles of that era. Here's the thing about the Ram Chargers that I keep coming back to every time I think about this story. They never set out to change drag racing. They set out to win drag races. The changes they forced were byproducts of their pursuit of victory, not the goals themselves. They weren't trying to invent funny car racing. They were trying to get better weight transfer on launch. They weren't trying to revolutionize engine development methodology. They were trying to find more horsepower in the max wedge. They weren't trying to demonstrate the value of data-driven competition. They were trying to beat Ford. Everything else followed from those simple, immediate competitive motivations, amplified through a culture of engineering excellence that produced results nobody else could match. And that might be the most instructive part of the entire story. Genuine innovation rarely looks like innovation from the inside. It looks like problem solving. It looks like the careful, systematic pursuit of specific, measurable goals. The Ram Chargers weren't visionaries in the romantic sense. They were engineers. They saw problems, they analyzed them, they built solutions, and they tested those solutions against the hardest possible standard: actual competition against the best teams in the country. The vision came from the accumulated results of that process, not from any grand plan conceived in advance. So the next time you see a funny car doing a full throttle pass, body floating up off the chassis, tire smoke billowing, crowd going absolutely insane, remember that it traces its lineage to a group of Chrysler engineers who noticed an ambiguity in a rulebook and built a funny-looking Dodge to exploit it. The next time you see a Hemi badge on a modern Dodge, remember that the name carries 60 years of competition credibility earned run by run at tracks across the country by people who cared enough to measure everything and document everything, and never stop asking whether there was a faster way. The Ram Chargers didn't just win races. They changed what winning meant. They raised the standard for what it looked like to compete seriously, and drag racing has never gone back to the way it was before them. That is a legacy worth knowing. That is a legacy worth remembering. And honestly, that is exactly the kind of story that makes me grateful I get to spend way too much time thinking about this stuff. Had you heard of the Ram Chargers before this video? Drop it in the comments below. I genuinely want to know, because this is a story that deserves a much bigger audience than it currently has. If this video helped you understand something about motorsport history that you didn't know before, hit that thumbs up button. It helps more people find content like this. And if you want more deep dives into the engineering brilliance and competitive obsession that shaped American motorsport, subscribe. We are just getting started.